August 14, 1847, midnight, the Beaumont estate 30 miles west of New Orleans, where the cicadas screamed and the Mississippi air hung thick as gilt. Inside the manor's east wing, beneath a canopy bed draped in imported silk, just Governor Tine Beaumont's wife, Madame Céleste Beaumont, porcelain-skinned daughter of French aristocracy, lay entwined with a man who was not her husband. His name was Samuel, suggests a 23-year-old enslaved blacksmith whose hands had built the very iron gates that imprisoned him. This was not love. This was blasphemy. This was the spark that would burn an empire to ash. Suggests the affair had been whispered about in the slave quarters for months, soft rumors carried on the wind like poison. But whispers are patient. They wait. They grow on this night. They would explode into a scandal so volcanic it would shatter the Beaumont dynasty, topple a governor, and ignite a reckoning that would ripple through Louisiana's cotton-soaked elite. This was more than infidelity. In the eyes of the South, this was treason against the racial order, a violation of the sacred hierarchy that kept the plantation world alive. Céleste Beaumont had not just broken a marriage vow, she had torn apart the very fabric of power, privilege, and white supremacy, jests, and for that there would be no forgiveness. Only ruin. The governor was in Baton Rouge that week, shaking hands and signing laws that kept men like Samuel in chains. He had no idea, but someone else did, someone who had been watching, waiting, sharpening their blade of vengeance in the dark. And when the truth came to light, it would not arrive quietly. It would crash through the manor doors like a hurricane, dragging with it bloodshed, betrayal, suggests, and the complete annihilation of everything the Beaumonts had built. So before we descend into that storm, before we walk through the wreckage of this unholy affair, let me ask you this: are you ready to witness the fall of gods? Then stay with me. Just subscribe, comment below what you think happened next. Because what follows is not just history, it's a legend born in fire and soaked in ruin. Samuel had not asked for this. He had not pursued it, had not schemed or seduced. He had simply existed, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that could bend iron and eyes that held a quiet, unbreakable dignity despite the brand on his shoulder that marked him as property. Céleste had noticed him first during the spring of 1846, suggests when he repaired the balcony railing outside her bedroom. She watched him work in silence, mesmerized by the precision of his movements, the way sweat carved rivers down his back beneath the brutal Louisiana sun. She had been raised to see men like Samuel as invisible, tools, livestock, shadows that moved at the edge of her perfumed world. But something in her had cracked that day. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was rebellion against a loveless marriage to a man 30 years her senior, a man who smelled of cigars and political ambition, who touched her twice a month with the enthusiasm of someone signing a contract. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more dangerous: desire, real human forbidden desire that did not care about laws or skin or the world that would burn them both alive if it ever found out. The affair began in secrecy, in stolen moments when the overseer was drunk and the house staff had retired. Céleste would slip into the forge at dusk, disguised in a servant's shawl, and Samuel would meet her there among the hammers and the heat. They spoke little at first, just what was there to say? She was a prisoner of silk and status. He was a prisoner of iron and law, but in those moments beneath the glow of dying coals they were something else, something neither of them had words for. She brought him books, poetry, philosophy, things he was forbidden to read. He taught her the names of constellations his mother had whispered to him before she was sold away. It was not love, not in the way romance novels painted it. It was survival. It was two people gasping for air in a world built to suffocate them, and it was doomed from the very beginning. But in the world of Louisiana plantations, nothing stayed secret for long. The estate was a living organism of eyes and ears, house slaves who moved like ghosts through hallways, field hands who saw everything from the cotton rows, overseers who patrolled the grounds with whips and suspicion. And among them all, suggests, there was one who watched Céleste and Samuel with particular venom, a woman named Lucille, the Beaumont family's head house servant, a 40-year-old mulatto woman who had served the family since she was a child. Lucille had her own history with the Beaumonts, a history written in scars and silence, in nights when the governor's father had summoned her to his chambers, in a daughter she had birthed and watched sold downriver before the child could speak her name. Lucille had learned long ago that survival meant loyalty to the masters, even when that loyalty tasted like poison. She had risen to a position of relative power within the household by being the governor's eyes and ears, by reporting infractions, by keeping the other slaves in line with threats and whispered warnings. She was hated by most, feared by all, and trusted by Etienne Beaumont himself. And Lucille despised Céleste Beaumont with a fury that burned cold and patient. She despised her for her youth, her beauty, her ignorance of the suffering that built the marble floors she walked upon. But more than that, she despised her for the affair, not out of moral righteousness but out of bitter, jealous rage. Because Lucille had loved Samuel once in her own quiet way, had watched him grow from a boy into a man, had hoped that perhaps in the margins of their enslaved existence, there might be something between them. But Samuel had never looked at her the way he looked at Madame Beaumont, and that rejection, layered atop a lifetime of humiliation, had curdled into something monstrous. So Lucille watched. She documented. She waited for the perfect moment to strike, knowing that when she did, the explosion would consume them all, and she would be there to watch the flames. The governor, Etienne Beaumont, was a man built on illusion. To the public, he was a pillar of Southern virtue, a decorated military officer turned politician, a man who spoke eloquently about states' rights and the divine order of the races, jests, who attended church every Sunday with his Bible tucked under his arm and his wife draped on the other. He had inherited the plantation from his father, a ruthless Creole trader who had amassed a fortune in sugar and human flesh. And Etienne had expanded that empire with cold, calculated precision, 3,000 acres, 200 enslaved souls, a mansion that rivaled the finest estates in Natchez and Charleston. He had married C.A. Lest in 1844, not for love, but for alliance. Her father was a French diplomat with connections in Paris and Washington, and the union had been a strategic masterpiece that elevated Etienne's political ambitions to the governor's office by 1846. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a smile that never reached past his teeth. He did not love his wife. He loved what she represented: purity, European prestige, the aesthetic perfection required of a man in his position. But beneath the polished surface, Etienne Beaumont was rotting. He drank brandy until dawn in his study, haunted by debts he kept hidden from even his closest advisors, gambling losses in New Orleans, jests, risky investments in railroads that had collapsed, loans taken from men who did not forgive. He was a governor on the verge of financial ruin, holding his empire together with smoke and mirrors, with speeches and spectacle. And he was cruel. Not in the loud, brutish way of overseers who whipped for sport, but in the quiet, bureaucratic cruelty of a man who signed sale orders that separated mothers from children, who punished resistance with surgical precision, who believed in his bones that God had ordained him to rule over lesser beings. He had never suspected his wife betrayal. How could he? In his mind, C.A. Lest was a possession, a decorative element of his household, incapable of agency or desire. That blindness would be his undoing. The night of August 14th began like any other. Etienne was in Baton Rouge, attending a legislative session that would keep him away for 3 more days. C.A. Lest had dined alone in the Grand Hall, jests, picking at roasted quail and potatoes while candlelight flickered against the oil portraits of Beaumont ancestors who glared down at her with dead, judgmental eyes. She dismissed the house staff early, claiming a headache, a lie she had perfected over the months. By 10 o'clock, the manor was silent except for the distant songs rising from the slave quarters, mournful hymns that drifted through the humid night like prayers to a God who never answered. C.A. Lest waited in her chambers, heart hammering against her ribs until the clock struck 11. Then she moved. She slipped through the east corridor, suggests past the library, down the servants' staircase that creaked beneath her bare feet. She had done this a dozen times before, knew which floorboards to avoid, which shadows to hide in. The night air hit her skin like a baptism as she crossed the courtyard toward the old carriage house where Samuel had been quartered after the main slave cabins grew overcrowded. It was a small, crude structure with a dirt floor and a single window, jests, but it had become their sanctuary, the only place in the world where the chains fell away, where she was not Madame Beaumont and he was not property, just 2 people. Just breath and skin and the terrifying, impossible intimacy of being seen, suggests. Samuel was waiting. He always was. Shirtless, leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. He never smiled when she arrived. There was no romance in this, no fantasy. Only the grim reality that every meeting could be their last. That discovery meant death for him and ruin for her. Though his death would be infinitely worse, slower, more public, designed to be a lesson etched in blood and screams, jests. "You shouldn't come anymore," he said quietly, the same words he spoke every time. And every time she ignored him, stepping into the shadows, into his arms, into the lie they had built together. But tonight was different. Tonight, Lucille was watching. She had positioned herself in the darkness behind the washhouse, wrapped in a black shawl invisible as smoke. She had suspected for weeks, had pieced together the patterns. The way C.A. Lest dismissed the staff early on certain nights, the way Samuel returned to his quarters later than the others, the way they both carried the same haunted look in the mornings, like soldiers who had survived a battle no one else could see. Lucille had waited for confirmation, for the irrefutable proof she would need to deliver her vengeance. And now, as she watched C.A. Lest slip through the carriage house door, watched the shadows merge inside, watched the flicker of candlelight bloom against the thin walls, she had it. Her heart did not race. Her hands did not tremble. She felt only a cold, crystalline satisfaction, the kind that comes when a long-laid trap finally snaps shut. She did not act immediately. That would have been foolish, reckless. No, Lucille understood power. She understood that timing was everything. That information was currency, and that the right word whispered into the right ear at the right moment could topple kingdoms. She waited 30 minutes, watching the carriage house with the patience of a predator, memorizing every detail, just every second. Then she turned and walked slowly back toward the main house, her mind already calculating the next move. She would not go to the overseer. He was a drunkard, unreliable, suggests prone to impulsive violence that might ruin the spectacle she envisioned. No, she would wait for the governor's return. She would go directly to Etan Beaumont himself, suggests, would kneel before him with tears in her eyes and deliver the news with the perfect blend of loyalty and sorrow. Master, it breaks my heart to tell you this, but I must. Your wife and the blacksmith Samuel. I have seen them together, suggests. I have tried to deny it, tried to believe my eyes deceived me, but I can no longer stay silent. You must know. You must act. And Etienne Beaumont would act. Oh, he would act with the full fury of a humiliated god. 3 days later, jests, on the morning of August 17th, Governor Ton Beaumont returned to the estate. He arrived earlier than expected, his carriage rattling up the Oak Line Drive just after dawn, dust rising like smoke in the golden light. He was in fall spirits. The legislative session had been a disaster, his opponents circling like vultures, rumors of his financial troubles beginning to leak into the political sphere. He needed control. He needed order. He needed his household to be the one domain where his authority remained absolute. Lucille was waiting for him in the foyer, her face a mask of carefully practiced distress. She curtsied low as he entered, her voice trembling with just the right amount of hesitation. Master Beaumont, forgive me, there is something you must know. Something that pains me to speak of, but my loyalty to this family compels me to break my silence. Etienne stopped, his eyes narrowing. He dismissed the butler with a wave of his hand and gestured for Lucille to follow him into his study. The door closed. For 10 minutes the house held its breath. Then came the sound, not at something worse. A low, guttural roar, the sound of a man whose entire identity had just been shattered. Objects crashed. Glass broke. A portrait frame splintered against the wall. The house slaves froze in the hallways, exchanging terrified glances, jests, knowing that whatever storm had been unleashed, it would consume more than just the guilty. Etienne emerged from the study with his face drained of color, his hands shaking, his eyes burning with a madness that made even Lucille step back. He did not speak. He simply turned to the nearest house servant, a young boy named Thomas, and hissed, "Find Jeremiah. Tell him to gather 6 men armed." Now, Jeremiah was the head overseer, a Georgia-born sadist with a scarred face and a reputation for brutality that made even hardened slaveholders uncomfortable. He had been hired specifically for his willingness to do the ugliest work, just to be the instrument of terror that kept rebellion crushed before it could even whisper. Within 20 minutes, he and 6 armed men stood assembled in the courtyard awaiting orders. Samuel was at the forge when they came for him. He was hammering a plow blade, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoing across the work yard, sweat pouring down his face in the mid-morning heat. He did not hear them approach over the noise of his own labor, did not see the shadows converging until it was too late. Jeremiah struck first, a rifle butt to the back of Samuel's skull that sent him crashing to the dirt, blood blooming across his scalp. The hammer fell from his hand. Before he could rise, before he could even understand what was happening, they were on him. 6 men with fists and boots and chains, beating him with the methodical efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Samuel tried to fight back, his blacksmith strength allowing him to throw one man off, to crack another's jaw with a wild swing, but it was useless. They overwhelmed him, dragged him down, shackled his wrists and ankles with iron that he himself had forged in this very shop. The other slaves watched from a distance, frozen in terror, knowing that any attempt to intervene would mean their own deaths. Samuel's face was a mask of blood by the time they hauled him upright. But his eyes, those eyes that had once gazed at constellations, that had looked at Celeste with something resembling hope, remained defiant. Jeremiah leaned in close, his breath reeking of tobacco and rot. "You stupid, arrogant N.R., he whispered, venom dripping from every syllable. "You thought you could touch what belongs to a white man? You thought there wouldn't be a reckoning." Samuel said nothing. He had known this moment would come eventually. From the first night Celeste had appeared in the forge, he had known. This world did not forgive men like him for being human. It did not forgive desire, or dignity, or the audacity of believing he deserved anything beyond chains and suffering. They dragged him across the grounds toward the main house, his knees scraping through gravel and mud, his blood leaving a trail like breadcrumbs. The house slaves scattered as the procession passed, some weeping, others muttering prayers under their breath. Celeste heard the commotion from her bedroom, the shouts, the sound of chains rattling, the heavy boots on the gravel below. Her blood turned to ice. She ran to the window and saw them, Jeremiah and his men dragging Samuel's bloodied body across the courtyard like a slaughtered animal. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream that clawed at her throat. She knew, instantly she knew. Someone had seen, someone had told. The world she had tried so desperately to keep hidden had been ripped open, and now the consequences were crashing down like an avalanche. She stumbled backward, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. Deny everything, claim Samuel had forced himself upon her, play the victim, the helpless white woman assaulted by a savage. It was the script the South had written 1,000 times, suggests, the lie that had lynched countless innocent men. She could use it, she could save herself, but even as the thought formed, something inside her recoiled. She had been many things, a coward, a liar, suggests, a woman complicit in the machinery of slavery by virtue of her silence and privilege. But could she become that? Could she condemn Samuel to a death even more horrific than the one already awaiting him, all to preserve her own reputation? Her hands shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She heard footsteps thundering up the main staircase, heard her husband's voice bellowing her name with a fury that made the walls tremble. There was no time to think, to plan, to prepare a defense. The door to her bedroom exploded open, and there stood Etienne Beaumont, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, his eyes wild with the kind of madness that comes when a man's entire sense of self has been annihilated. "Jests, you whore," he whispered, the words more terrifying for their quietness than any shout could have been. "You filthy, treacherous whore." Celeste did not speak, she could not. Behind Etienne stood Lucille, her face expressionless, her eyes glittering with satisfaction. The trap had been sprung, the reckoning had begun, and there would be no mercy for anyone. Etienne crossed the room in 3 strides and struck Celeste across the face with the back of his hand. A blow so vicious it sent her sprawling onto the floor, her lid splitting, blood staining the white lace of her nightgown. Jests. She tasted copper and terror. He stood over her trembling with a violence barely restrained, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "How long," he demanded, his voice cracking. "Jests. How long have you been spreading your legs for that animal? How long have you made a fool of me?" Celeste tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? What defense existed in a world where her husband owned her as surely as he owned Samuel, where her body was property and her will was irrelevant? She had broken the only rule that mattered. She had chosen. Jests. She had exercised agency in a system designed to strip it from her, and for that, she would be destroyed. Etienne grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to her feet, his face inches from hers. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "Suggests. Do you understand what this will do to me? To my career? To this family's name?" Not once did he ask if she had been coerced. Not once did he consider that she might have been suffering in their marriage. Jests. That she might have been desperately lonely, that she might have been anything other than a rebellious object that had malfunctioned. To him, this was not about her humanity. It was about his humiliation, his political survival, his status among the white planter elite who would laugh at him, mock him, strip him of power the moment the story spread. And it would spread. Scandals like this always did, whispered in parlors and printed in newspapers, jests, dissected and devoured by a society ravenous for the spectacle of fallen aristocrats. He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling into the bedpost. "Get dressed," he commanded coldly. "You will bear witness to what happens next." Jests. "You will watch what your sin has wrought, and then we will decide what to do with you." They assembled the entire plantation in the clearing beside the main house. Every enslaved person, from the eldest field hand to the youngest child, forced to stand in rows under the merciless August sun. This was the theater of terror that sustained the institution, the public ritual of punishment designed not just to destroy one man, but to send a message to all the others. This is what happens when you forget your place. Samuel was dragged to the center of the clearing, still shackled, barely conscious, his face so swollen he could hardly see. A whipping post stood there, ancient and stained with the blood of countless others who had been broken against it. Jeremiah and his men chained Samuel to the post, arms stretched above his head, his back exposed. The crowd of enslaved witnesses stood in silence, their faces carved from stone, their eyes burning with grief and impotent rage. They knew Samuel. He was their blacksmith, their teacher, the man who fixed their tools and whispered stories to their children. Jests, and now they would be forced to watch him die. Etienne Beaumont emerged from the house with Celeste gripped firmly by the arm, her face bruised, her dress hastily thrown on, her eyes red from weeping. He positioned her at the front of the assembly, forcing her to stand where she could see everything, where she could not turn away. "Look at him," Etienne commanded, his voice carrying across the clearing. Jests. "Look at what your lust has brought upon this creature. Every stroke of the whip, every drop of blood, this is your doing." Celeste's legs trembled. She felt the eyes of 200 people upon her, enslaved people who had every reason to hate her, to see her as complicit in their suffering, as the embodiment of the cruelty that ruled their lives. And yet, in some of their faces, Jests, she saw something else. Not sympathy exactly, but a grim recognition. They understood that she, too, was trapped in this machinery of power, that her gilded cage was still a cage, that her punishment would be different but no less devastating. Jeremiah stepped forward, coiling a bullwhip in his scarred hands, a weapon he had named Judgment, a 9-foot length of braided leather that had torn the flesh from hundreds of backs over his brutal career. He turned to face the assembly, his voice booming with the rehearsed authority of a man who believed himself an instrument of divine order. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he announced. This Nunkar forgot what he was. He forgot that God Almighty made him to serve, to obey, to know his place beneath his betters. He dared to defile a white woman, to commit an abomination against nature and law. For this crime, there is only one answer. He cracked the whip once in the air, a sound like thunder that made children bury their faces in their mother's skirts. Samuel's shoulders tensed, his fingers gripping the chains that bound him. He did not beg. He did not plead. He had decided, in whatever corner of his mind still belonged to him, that he would not give them the satisfaction of his degradation. The first lash came without further ceremony. The whip cut through the air and bit into Samuel's back with a wet, tearing sound that turned C.A. Lesty's stomach. His body jerked against the post, but he made no sound. The second lash followed, then the third. Suggest each one carving red canyons across his flesh, each one designed not just to punish but to erase, to strip away his humanity one layer of skin at a time. By the 10th lash his back was a ruin of exposed muscle and flowing blood. By the 20th, jests. His silence finally broke, a low animal groan that seemed to rise not from his throat but from somewhere deeper, from the accumulated suffering of every enslaved person who had ever been chained to this post. C.A. Lest tried to look away, but E. Tynan's hand clamped on her jaw, forcing her face forward. "Watch," he hissed into her ear. "This is love, C.A. Lest. This is what your love looks like." The whipping continued. 30 lashes. 40. The crowd stood frozen in horror. Suggests. Some weeping silently, others praying under their breath. 50 lashes. 60. Samuel's body hung limp against the post, now held upright only by the chains, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a storm. The clearing had become a cathedral of suffering, the air thick with blood and the metallic taste of injustice. This is the world we are walking through together, a world where power devours the powerless, jests, where love becomes evidence in a trial that was rigged from the beginning. And before we continue deeper into this darkness, before we witness the final act of this tragedy, I need you to understand something. Stories like this matter. They echo across time. They remind us of the cost of silence, of complicity, of systems built on cruelty. So if this story has gripped you, if you feel the weight of it pressing against your chest, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with the name of someone history forgot, someone whose suffering deserves to be remembered. Because Samuel's story doesn't end at this whipping post. What comes next will turn him into legend, a ghost that Louisiana will never be able to exorcise. At 70 lashes, Jeremiah finally stopped, not out of mercy, suggests, but out of practicality. Samuel needed to survive long enough for the true punishment to begin. The whipping was only the opening act. Beaumont had spent the morning consulting with other planners, with men who understood the delicate art of making examples, of transforming human beings into warnings. They had agreed Samuel could not simply be killed. That would be too quick, too clean, too private. No, his destruction had to be spectacular, just public, a story that would be told in every parlor and pulpit from New Orleans to Natchez. He had to be unmade so thoroughly that his very name would become synonymous with the consequences of transgression. Jeremiah cut Samuel down from the post, and the young man collapsed into the dirt, his ruined back a landscape of agony. They threw a bucket of salt water over his wounds, a technique designed to prevent infection while maximizing suffering, to keep him conscious and aware for what came next. Etienne stepped forward, addressing the assembled crowd with the practiced rhetoric of a politician. "This man will not die today," he announced. "Death would be too kind. Instead, jests, he will carry the mark of his sin for whatever remains of his miserable life. He will be sold downriver to the sugar plantations, where the work kills a man in 7 years, where he will labor in the fields until his body breaks and his mind shatters. But before he goes, he will be branded, not with the mark of ownership, but with the mark of his crime." He gestured to the forge, where a branding iron had been heating in the coals since dawn. The iron had been specially made for this occasion, shaped into a single letter A. For adulterer, for abomination, for the scarlet letter that would follow Samuel into whatever hell awaited him in the cane fields of the deep south. 2 men dragged Samuel to his knees before the forge. Jeremiah retrieved the glowing iron, its tip radiating heat that shimmered in the air like a mirage. They held Samuel down as Jeremiah approached with the brand, the iron glowing white, hot, radiating a heat so intense that those standing nearby could feel it against their faces. Samuel's eyes, swollen and barely open, fixed on the approaching iron with a clarity that cut through his pain. In that moment, something shifted in him. Some final barrier between suffering and transcendence broke apart. He stopped fighting. He stopped resisting. He simply stared at Eton Beaumont with an expression that was neither hate nor fear, but something far more unsettling, pity. As if Samuel could see what the governor could not. that this spectacle of dominance was actually an admission of profound weakness, that a man secure in his power would not need such theater jests, that every scar carved into Samuel's flesh was evidence of Tian's own fragility. The governor saw that look and it enraged him more than the affair itself. "Brand him," he commanded, his voice breaking. Jeremiah pressed the iron against Samuel's chest just above his heart. The sound was worse than the sight, the hiss of burning flesh, the smell of cooking meat, the smoke that rose from Samuel's body like an offering to a savage god. This time, Samuel screamed, not the broken groan of a man being whipped, but a full-throated cry that seemed to tear the sky itself, a sound so raw and primal that several of the enslaved witnesses fell to their knees unable to bear it. Celeste collapsed, vomiting into the dirt, her body convulsing with sobs. But Jeremiah held the iron in place for a full 30 seconds, ensuring the brand would scar deep, would never fade, would mark Samuel forever as a cautionary tale. Suggests when he finally pulled the iron away, the letter A was burned into Samuel's chest, the flesh around it blistered and weeping. Samuel did not pass out. He remained conscious, his breathing ragged, his body trembling. And when Jeremiah stepped back, suggests when the crowd thought the horror had finally ended, Samuel did something no one expected. He began to laugh. A broken, wheezing sound that held no joy, only the terrible freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose. 6. The laughter died in Samuel's throat as they dragged him away toward the wagon that would carry him downriver, away from the only world he had ever known, toward the sugar plantations where enslaved people were worked to death in a grinding calculus of profit over humanity. But before the wagon could depart, before Samuel could disappear into the machinery of Deep South slavery, suggests a voice cut through the clearing, sharp, desperate, and utterly reckless. Stop. It was Celeste. She had risen from the dirt where she had collapsed, her face streaked with tears and vomit, her dress stained with blood and mud. Jests. She walked forward on unsteady legs, pushing past Tien's attempt to restrain her, moving toward Samuel with the determination of someone who had finally found the courage that had eluded her for 23 years of passive existence. Suggests, stop this, she said again, louder now, her voice cracking but clear. I will not let you do this. I will not let you destroy him for something I initiated, something I chose. The clearing fell into stunned silence. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. Etine stared at his wife as if she had sprouted a second head. Get back to the house, he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. But Celeste did not move. She turned to face the assembled crowd, enslaved people, overseers, house servants, everyone who had been forced to witness this brutality. I am the one who pursued him, she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with each word. I am the one who came to him night after night. He told me to stop. He told me it would end like this. But I was selfish. I was lonely. I was trapped in a marriage that felt like a tomb, and I used him, yes, used him, to feel something, anything, that resembled being alive. He is guilty of nothing except being seen as human by someone who should have known better than to endanger him with her need. It was the truth, raw and unvarnished, and it detonated like a bomb across the plantation. Jess Piton moved with a speed that belied his age. He crossed the distance between them and struck Celeste again, this time with a closed fist that sent her sprawling to the ground, blood streaming from her nose. Shut your mouth, he roared. His composure completely shattered now, the veneer of civilized authority crumbling to reveal the raw terror beneath. Terror that her confession would spread, that the newspapers would seize upon it, that instead of being the righteous victim of a slave's assault, he would become the laughingstock of Louisiana, the cuckold whose wife had publicly admitted to seducing an enslaved man. The political implications were catastrophic. Jests. His enemies would use this to destroy him, to strip him of the governorship, to drag the Beaumont name through the mud for generations. Lock her in her chambers, he commanded 2 house servants. She is to speak to no one. No one enters. No one leaves. She is mad with guilt and fever. That is the story. Do you understand me? But it was too late. The words had been spoken, the witnesses had heard, and in a world built on whispers and rumors, on information traded like currency in slave quarters and servants' halls and parlors across the South, Celeste's confession would travel faster than any attempt to suppress it. Already, the enslaved people in the crowd were committing her words to memory, knowing that this story, the story of a white woman who had told the truth, who had tried to save the man she had endangered, would become part of the secret history passed down in songs and stories, in the coded language of survival. They would remember Samuel not as a victim of his own desire, suggests, but as a man who had been loved, however imperfectly, however dangerously, by someone who had finally chosen courage over self-preservation. As the servants dragged Celeste back toward the house, she locked eyes with Samuel one final time. He was barely conscious, his body broken, his future a nightmare of sugar cane and slow death. But in his eyes she saw something unexpected: forgiveness, not for what she had done to him, but for what she had tried in the end to undo. Samuel was sold 3 days later to a sugar broker from Terrebonne Parish for $800, a fraction of his worth, but Tyne wanted him gone immediately, vanished before the scandal could metastasize further. Jests. The wagon carried him south toward plantations where the life expectancy of an enslaved laborer was measured in seasons, not years, where men were ground down by 18-hour days cutting cane under a sun that felt like God's punishment. Suggests. Samuel died there in the spring of 1850, his body finally surrendering to infection, exhaustion, and the accumulated weight of suffering. He was 26 years old. They buried him in an unmarked grave alongside hundreds of others. Suggests men and women whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told. But Samuel did not disappear. His name lived on in the whispered legends of Louisiana's enslaved community, passed down through generations. The blacksmith who had been loved by a governor's wife, who had been branded and broken but never defeated. Jests who had laughed in the face of his tormentors and forced the world to see his humanity even as it tried to erase him. C.A. Leslie Beaumont never spoke again. Whether by choice or by madness brought on by trauma, history does not record. Jest Ian kept her locked in the east wing of the manor for 2 years, telling visitors she had suffered a nervous collapse. In 1849, she died officially of typhoid fever, though rumors persisted of poison, of suicide, of a woman who had simply stopped eating until her body gave out. Etienne Beaumont lost the governorship in the election of 1850, his reputation shattered by scandals he could never fully suppress. He died bankrupt in 1855. Just the plantation sold at auction, the Beaumont name reduced to a footnote in Louisiana history. But the story survived. It survived in the songs sung in slave quarters, in the warnings mothers gave their sons, jests, in the ghost stories told about the Beaumont estate where, they said, you could still hear a woman weeping in the east wing and smell the burning flesh of a blacksmith who refused to be forgotten. This is how legends are born, not in glory, but in the wreckage of empires built on blood. This is how the powerless become immortal.